Hi, my name is Bob Wheeler, and welcome to the Berean Observer, where we search the scriptures daily to see whether or not these things are so. Well, it just so happens that this week happens to be the 100th anniversary of the famous Scopes monkey trial, which took place in Dayton, Tennessee. And it prompted a worldwide debate, even though it's a tiny little town in the foothills of eastern Tennessee. This court trial wound up prompting a worldwide debate about the theory of evolution. What happened was that the state of Tennessee had passed a law forbidding the teaching of the theory of evolution in the public schools. The ACLU decided to try to challenge the law, and they were able to enlist Clarence Darrow as an attorney that was willing to argue the case. But then they needed a volunteer that they could, somebody that would actually get arrested for teaching the theory of evolution. So it turns out that the founder or the leaders of the little town of Dayton, Tennessee, thought that they could kind of boost some attention for their community by participating in this. So they persuaded a young teacher named John T. Scopes to actually go ahead and break this law by teaching about the theory of evolution. So then, sure enough, he got arrested, and the case went to trial. So basically, Clarence Darrow came in and he acted as the defense attorney for John T. Scopes. And meanwhile, William Jennings Bryan, a very famous and well known American politician, wound up becoming the prosecutor. And so this debate, turned out to be, this court trial turned out to be a debate between Darrow and Bryan. Well, at one point in the trial, Darrow wound up calling Bryan to the witness stand, kind of an unusual move. And Darrow wound up peppering Bryan with a bunch of questions about, the reliability of the Bible and what did Bryan really think about this and that and the other thing, Jonah and the whale and, the great flood and that kind of a thing. And Bryan did stumble over some of the answers. I mean, after all, he was a lawyer and a politician. He wasn't a Bible scholar, and so he wasn't prepared to give detailed answers on a lot of these things. The judge eventually ordered Bryan's testimony to be expunged from the record. Scopes was convicted, found guilty, because of course that was the whole idea behind the case in the first place. But then the Tennessee Supreme Court eventually overruled the $100 fine. But it raises an interest. But it did wind up becoming a kind of the case did draw worldwide attention because it involved a kind of a critical issue, I think, for human civilization. And that has to do about whether or not we can go by the biblical account of creation or whether or not the theory of evolution is really true. And basically what it is this. And it really was, and it could be argued that Darwin's Origin of the Species really was a turning point in the history of Western civilization. Basically, the theory of evolution had existed before Charles Darwin, but Darwin's big contribution to it was the idea of natural selection. And modern skeptics, like Jerry Coyne, for example, would argue that natural selection would have the effect of creating the appearance of design without there actually being a design. So that in turn would undermine the idea of intelligent design and the idea that we live in a rationally ordered universe that was created by an intelligent supreme being. So that raises a question that all of us have to face. When we're confronted with an apparent contradiction between science and the Bible, how do we resolve it? And basically, there are two key questions that we always have to ask. Number one, what can science actually prove? What are the hard facts? And then second of all, what does the Bible actually teach? So first of all, let's take a look at the question, what can science really prove? And one thing you have to keep in mind here is you have to ask the question, well, how does science go about proving anything? And the answer is you do it through the scientific method. It has to be based strictly on observation and experiment. And even then, it has to be argued that all of science's conclusions are tentative. And the reason why is because it's based on observation, but human observation is finite, which means that science always has to leave open the possibility that a new discovery will be made tomorrow that will overturn the theories that we have today. So, at any rate, so what exactly can we, when it comes to something like that, and one of the, we should mention this, that one of the problems with evolution is that when you get into like historical geology and historical biology, part of the problem is that these things supposedly happened millions of years before there were any human beings to observe what had happened. So that raises a question about how you could use the scientific method to establish that, species B evolved from species A. But basically, based on what we can actually observe, I would have to say that sedimentation is an observable fact of nature. We can actually watch that taking place in the world today. And therefore, I think it's very, very reasonable to suppose that the various layers of sedimentary rock represent successive geological ages. And it's kind of interesting in particular that I live here in north central Pennsylvania, not too far from the New York state line. And here in Pennsylvania, we do hydrofracking. And the idea is that we can extract natural gas from a rock formation called the Marcellus Shale, which is 4,000 to 8,500 feet underground, and it's anywhere from 50 to 200 feet thick. And basically, the reason why they can extract natural gas from the Marcellus Shale is because the Marcellus Shale contains the remains of organic material, which means that buried thousands of feet beneath the ground are these fossil remnants of organic material. And then there's an even deeper shale called the Utica Shale that's even deeper than that, 2 miles below sea level. So the thing about it is that when you take a look at the geological formations, it's hard to believe that all of that happened within the scope of just a single flood that lasted only a year. I mean, even here, where you drive around and where they've cut through rock formations and there's hundreds of feet of exposed sedimentary rock. And so that really poses to a very, very old Earth. And it's also true, too, very interestingly, that I think there's some very, very solid evidence that there actually was a major geological catastrophe, which is sometimes called the KT extinction event, or the Cretaceous Paleogenic extinction event, in which an asteroid crashed into the Yucatan Peninsula, and it had the effect of wiping out 75% of Mesozoic life. And it created a dust cloud that blocked sunlight for a year or more. So I think that that's what we can observe in the terms of geology. Now, evolution, however, is not observable based on actual observation and experiment. What we can see by looking at nature is that all living things occur in identifiable species. The species reproduce according to well-defined laws of heredity, as was proven by Gregor Mendel. We know that there's no such thing as spontaneous generation. We know that order doesn't spontaneously arise out of chaos, except in isolated cases like, snowflakes, for example. And then when you take a look at the fossil record, you find out that it doesn't necessarily support the idea of evolution either, because evolution would have to presuppose this very long, slow, gradual, continuous process that takes place over a long period of time. But when you take a look at the fossil record, there are gaps in the fossil record. We see that the fossils occur in identifiable species, that there is a lack of transitional forms, and then, of course, as we just saw, that there's geological evidence for there's evidence for geological catastrophes and extinction events. And so, for example, if this KT extinction event took place and it brought to an end the Mesozoic era and then started the Cenozoic era, the big problem for the evolutionists then is how can Cenozoic life have evolved from Mesozoic life if Mesozoic life was largely destroyed during the KT extinction event? So basically, it supports I think that science, geology supports the idea of an old Earth, but not the theory of evolution. So then you turn to the scriptures and you ask the question, okay, so what does the Bible actually teach? And that brings us to Genesis chapter 1. And there have been, historically, there have been different interpretations of it. There are, of course, young earth creationists who would try to argue that basically the whole chapter is describing an event that took place 6,000 years ago. Some people, of course, have realized that that's a little bit hard to reconcile with the geological evidence that we just pointed out. So another way of explaining it would be what's called the day-age theory, where each of the 6 days of creation would represent supposedly a different geological era. There's a couple of problems with that theory, though. One of them is the word day is actually defined in the text itself as night and day, or evening and daylight. And So that would lead you to believe that the author intended for us to understand it as basically 24-hour days. The other problem too is that you have the situation where you have, um, you know, you have sunlight before before the sun, and uh, and so it's very very hard to see how that the world could survive. If basically you're talking about periods of thousands of years before one thing happened and another. So I'm going to argue that the best way to interpret it is what's known as the gap theory. That basically there's a gap between verse 1, which says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth," and verse 2, which says, "The earth was formless and void, and darkness is over the surface of the deep." Um, this theory was proposed at one time by a great early 19th century Scottish theologian named Thomas Chalmers. And basically, it also got picked up, interestingly, in the Schofield Reference Bible. And basically, then, what it boils down to is that when you look at Genesis 1 that way, verse 1 says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." So what we have there basically is just an introductory statement, very, very broad and general in scope, and it doesn't necessarily, and that's basically all that it says. Then verse 2 says, "The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the face of the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters." Now, I think here, I'm reading this from the New American Standard Version, and the way they have it translated in the text, I think, is a bit of when it says formless and void, is a mistranslation. The margin does say waste and emptiness, and I think that's probably makes more sense in this context. It's the Hebrew phrase tohu vavohu, and it actually appears in elsewhere in Jeremiah. Jeremiah 4:23, a passage is describing about the destruction of Judah. So in that context, obviously Judah was in a formless mass. So I think it would fit it here that it was a waste and an emptiness. And I think what it is that verse 2 would actually describe what the world looked like after the KT extinction event. Okay? So then we go on to the first day, verses 3 through 5. And we have the light appearing before the sun, which is in verse 6. And some people wonder, well, how can that be? And I would argue that actually the sun was literally there. And again, there's certain rules of interpretation I should mention here about how to interpret the Bible. Number one, it is not the intention of the Bible to give us a detailed scientific explanation of how nature works. Okay? So typically what will happen is it'll describe natural phenomena from the standpoint of the human observer standing on the ground. And so we're talking about appearances. Second of all, you have to keep in mind that the main focus of Scripture is on God's interactions with the human race. And so it's not really the purpose of Scripture to go in and give us a detailed, lengthy geological history of the world and what happened before the creation of man. Basically, it starts off with the creation of the human race, which I would argue would be after the KT extinction event. So then if you ask the question, why was light created, why did light appear in verses 3 through 5, and then God, in verse 3 says, "Then God said, let there be light, and there was light." And then it says, and then the sun didn't appear until later on. And the answer is that I think that the sun was always there, but this KT extinction event filled the air with this tremendous cloud of dust. And so after a while, first the world was completely dark. The sun was completely blacked out. And then as the dust began to slowly dissipate, the skies would start to light up. So it would appear to be light there, but it would still be several more days before heavenly bodies would actually become visible in the sky. And I think that's what's being described here in chapter 1, Genesis chapter 1. And then it talks in the second day, verses 6 through 8, it says, "Then let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let us separate the waters from the waters." So basically what you had was the formation of the clouds from the oceans down below. And then in verses 9 through 13, you get to the third day of creation. And it says, Let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And it's very, very interesting because there actually is some interesting geological information for that. The idea that there was a thrusting and folding that went on. Um, the Rocky Mountains, in fact, were supposedly founded right about the time of the KT extinction event. And I know right here in Tioga County, Pennsylvania, where I live on the top of a geological formation called the Allegheny Plateau, and we're hundreds of feet above sea level, and yet most of the fossils that you find here are marine fossils, and that implies that at some point in the past there was an uplifting, giant uplifting, and I think that's what's being described here in these verses. And then, of course, it goes on in the heavenly bodies appear in the fourth day, and that was when this cloud, this dust cloud, further dissipated, and you could actually see the celestial beings. Then, of course, the account goes on to talk about the creation of man. So I think that if you look at it that way, it makes perfectly good sense, and it can be reconciled with what we can actually observe in terms of the geological and the fossil record. So what it all boils down to is this, that the appearance of age is evidence of age, the appearance of design is evidence of design. We live in an old universe that was created by an intelligent supreme being. And I think it's a very, very important issue because I think it could be argued that the theory of evolution, Darwin's theory of evolution, was really the undoing of modern society. Because what we live in is a rationally ordered universe created by an intelligent supreme being. And that means that everything was meant to function a certain way. Well, what happened is that because of the theory of evolution, and especially because of this idea of natural selection, Darwin got rid of the idea of intelligent design, and that meant then that that's been the undoing of Western civilization. People wind up arguing that there are no universal truths. Everything came into existence through a blind, impersonal, natural process. There's no supreme being who has created things, and therefore it becomes virtually impossible to establish a coherent system of morality. And that has been the undoing of we've gotten rid of universal truths, moral absolutes, and social norms. And this in turn has resulted in the disintegration of Western society, and in particular the destruction of the family structure. I sometimes say that the real problem facing America today at the practical level isn't so much homosexuals getting married as it is heterosexuals not getting married. The family structure is falling apart. We have a whole generation of children growing up in these dysfunctional single-parent families. And what really worries me to no end are the young boys growing up in these fatherless homes that have little or no contact with their biological fathers. And you figure when they reach adulthood, what are they going to be like? What's this world going to look like, this country, this world going to look like 10, 20 years from now when my generation has passed away? And the bottom line is that we can only achieve peace and happiness and fulfillment by coming into conformity with God's creative purpose. We have to see the world as something that was created by God. And everything was meant to function a certain way. And in order to live a happy, fulfilled life, we have to live our lives the way God, our Creator, intended it to be. So I hope that it was challenging to your thinking and that you'll give it some serious thought. And we hope to see you again. Bye now.